Hello, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. This is Guy de Maupassant, short story called Boule de Suif. This is part 4 of 4 parts that we're reading together, translated by Roger Collette. Hopefully, you read the first 3 parts. We left off. We know why they're being held in totes, because the Prussian officer wants to sleep with Boule de Suif. And now the travelers, her fellow travelers, are starting to get a little irritated. Let's go, shall we? So they're getting a little irritated, but nobody as yet was prepared to put these thoughts into words. What are those thoughts? Well, why didn't she just do it on the sly? She could, she could have surprised us all. The thoughts we just read in the last part. In the afternoon, as they were bored stiff, the Count suggested a stroll around the village, and everybody wrapped up warmly, and the little party set off, with the exception of Courtenay, who preferred to stay by the fire, and the nuns, who were spending their days in the church or with the parish priest. The cold, which was becoming more intense every day, nipped their noses and their ears cruelly. Their feet hurt so badly that every step was agony, and when the country came into sight, it looked so dreadfully bleak under its unbroken pall of snow that they all turned back immediately, and their spirits chilled and their hearts numbed. 4 women walked in front, with the 3 men not far behind. Louisio, who understood the situation perfectly, suddenly asked how much longer that tart was going to keep them hanging around this godforsaken place. Can you imagine this guy? The Count, as chivalrous as ever, said no woman could be called upon to make such a painful sacrifice. The offer must come from herself. Monsieur Carrère-Lamandan observed that if, as was considered likely, that the French launched a counter-attack by way of Dieppe, the only place where the 2 armies could meet was Totes, and this remark made the other 2 people uneasy. Don't forget, there's a war going on, right? How about trying to get away on foot? Said Louisio. The Count shrugged his shoulders. Out of the question, he said. In all this snow, with our wives as well. Besides, we would be pursued straight away, caught within 10 minutes, and brought back as prisoners at the mercy of the soldiers. I would say what they're at now is prisoners. Would you agree with that? This was obviously true, and nothing more was said. The ladies were talking about clothes, but there was a certain constraint that seemed to have shattered the harmony between them. There was harmony between them. Remember that? All of a sudden, the officer appeared at the end of the street, and his tall, wasp-waisted, uniformed figure stood out sharply against the snow, and he was walking with his knees wide apart, with the gait peculiar to military men who are trying not to dirty their carefully polished boots. Strutting? He bowed as he passed the ladies, but he glanced contemptuously at the men who, for their part, had sufficient dignity not to raise their hats, although Louisio made as if to do so. Boule de Suif had blushed to the roots of her hair. But you know what blushing is? She felt shame, right? We talked about this. She turns red. She's blushing. And why is she blushing, ladies and gentlemen? Do you know why she's blushing? She's embarrassed, right? They all know what this guy wants from her. The 3 married women felt deeply humiliated at being seen by the officer in the company of this prostitute whom he had treated with such a cavalier fashion. What does that mean? Cavalier fashion means, he is treating her with the utmost feelings of seriousness, right? He's treating her seriously. Let's face it. Can he take her at any time he wants? Yes. Can he rape her if he wanted to? Yes. He's in charge. He's the soldier, right? They dominate. They're the Prussians. They got control of the town. But he doesn't do it. He's asking her to sleep with him. it's this to me, this is an interesting juxtaposition between these people and him. He's treating her in a cavalier fashion, and that makes these women deeply humiliated. Why didn't he pick one of them? I'm just saying. They began talking about him, discussing his looks and his general appearance. And Madame Grey-Lamandan, who had known a great many officers, and she could judge them with an expert eye, she declared that this one was quite presentable. She even expressed regret that he was not a Frenchman, because he would have made a very good-looking hussar, cavalryman. Every woman would have fallen madly in love with. Look at these people. When they got back to the inn, they did not know what to do with themselves. Sharp words were even exchanged over trivial matters. They're on edge, huh? Dinner was short, silent meal, and everybody went to bed, hoping to kill time by sleeping. Day 3. The next morning, they came downstairs with tired faces and frayed tempers, and the women scarcely spoke to Boule de Suif. The church bell started ringing for a christening. The fat young woman had a child who was being brought up in a peasant family at Yvonne, and she saw it once a year at most, but she never bothered her head about it. But the thought of the baby about to be christened filled her heart with a sudden, overpowering feeling of affection for her own offspring. So she decided that she simply had to attend the christening. Okay, so she's got a kid in another town being brought up, and she hears the bell for a christening, and she says, well, I got to go to the christening. She gets an overwhelming feeling of affection. As soon as she had gone, they all looked at one another and they put their chairs together, for everybody realized that it was time that they came to some decision. Loisio had an inspiration. He proposed suggesting to the officer that he should keep Boule de Suif and let the others go. Jerk. Monsieur Flauvenet once again agreed to act as intermediary, but he came back almost at once. The German, who knew what human nature was like, had shown him the door. He intended to detain the whole party until his demand had been satisfied. What does that mean, that the German knew what human nature was like? What does he know that you and I don't know yet? Why is he keeping everybody together? He knows what's going to happen. He can predict it, can he? Can you? After that, Madame Loisio's plebeian nature, commoner nature, broke out. Plebeian. Sorry. But we can't stand here to die of old age, she cried. Seeing that it's that slut's job to go with any man who wants her, I don't think she's got any right to refuse one man rather than another. Why, she took everybody who came to her in Rouen, even coachmen. Yes, madame. She even been with the perfect coachman. I know all about it. It's because he buys his wine from us. And now, when it's a question of getting us out of this hole, that hussy starts putting on airs. Personally, I think that officer is behaving very well. He may have had to go without it for a long time, and he probably would have preferred one of us three, but no. He makes to do with the common prostitute. He shows a proper respect for married women. Just think, he's the master here. He only had to give his men the order, and he could have had taken us by force. Wow. Read that speech again. I want to read it again to show you what a son of a gun this woman is, huh? The two women gave a little shudder. Pretty little Madame Carrère-Lamandan's eyes were shining, and she looked rather pale, as if she could already feel herself being raped by the officer. What is that all about? What is that all about? The men who had been conferring privately now joined the ladies, and Loisio, who was in a fury and wanted to hand the wretched woman over to the enemy, bound hand and foot. The Count, who was sprung from 3 generations of ambassadors, and he looked like a diplomat himself, advocated a more subtle approach. We have to persuade her to do it, he said. And so they set about hatching a plot. The women huddled together, voices lowered, and the discussion became general, each person expressing an opinion, but it was all perfectly respectable. The ladies in particular found delicate turns of phrases and charming euphemisms to express the coarsest ideas. Euphemisms. What is a euphemism, right? Sorry. What is a euphemism? It's a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. Died, pass away. See, died's harsh. He passed away. Not so harsh. He's not the sharpest tool in the shed instead of dumb. Euphemisms. So they're changing their phrases, right? They're changing their phrases. The conventions of polite conversation were so scrupulously observed that a stranger would have understood nothing of what they were really saying. But there was a thin veneer of modesty displayed by every woman of the world is only skin deep. And they reveled in this unsavory business, enjoying it tremendously, and feeling in their element as they laid their plans with the sensual enjoyment of an Epicurean chef cooking somebody else's dinner. Epicurean is an illusion. Who's Epicurus? Look it up, right? So these women are now, they're just taking great pleasure in plotting this. The whole affair struck them as so amusing that after a while their spirits rose again. The Count ventured a few jokes that were rather risky, but so well told that they made everybody smile. Louisio, in his turn, made some cruder remarks, and even these failed to give offense. Everybody was thinking of Madame Louisio's brutal observation, quote, "Seeing that it's that slut's job to go to bed with any man who wants her, I don't think she's any right to refuse one man over another." Indeed, pretty Madame Carré-Lamandan seemed to think that if she had been in Boule de Suif's place, she would have been less likely to refuse this particular man than most. Huh? Elaborate plans were laid for the blockade, as though for the siege of a fortress. It was agreed what each person should play, what arguments he would put forward, and what tactics he should use. The plan of attack was decided on, together with the stratagems to be employed and the surprise assaults to be delivered, in order to force a citadel of flesh and blood to yield admittance to the enemy. Well written, don't you think? Corneille remained aloof, refusing to have anything to do with the affair. But obviously he knows about it, he's listening to it, he just refuses to participate. Make a note. They were so absorbed in their plotting they didn't even hear Boule de Suif return. But then the Count's whispered, "Shh," made them all look up, and there she was. A sudden silence fell, and for the first, a feeling of embarrassment prevented them from speaking to her. Of course they should be embarrassed. But at last, however, the Countess, more adept than the rest at social duplicity, she asked her, "Did you enjoy the christening?" Hey, son of a gun. She doesn't care if she enjoyed the christening, does she? The fat young woman, still under the influence of the ceremony she had just witnessed, gave them all the details. How everybody looked, how everybody behaved, and even what the church looked like. She added, "It does you good to pray now and then. Do you see the innocence of Boule de Suif? Do you see this woman for what she is? Not her way she earns a living, but for what she is in her heart. This is very important to understanding what's going to happen to her. I want you to pay very strict attention to this." Until it was time for lunch, the ladies contented themselves with being pleasant to her in order to gain her confidence and make her more amiable to their advice. And as soon as they were seated at the table, however, the first moves were made. To begin with, there was the vague conversation about self-sacrifice. Examples were quoted from ancient history. Judith, Holofernes, next for no particular reason, Lucretia, Sextus, Cleopatra, taking all the enemy generals into her bed and reducing them to slavish obedience. Think about this, right? Now, if you're wondering what these names are, here's a little note. A beautiful Jewish widow named Judith left the besieged city in pretended flight and foretold to Holofernes that he would be victorious. Invited into his tent, she cut off his head, and he lay in a drunken sleep and brought in a bag of baba. Jewish victory over the leaderless Assyrian forces followed. Sextus raped her and was subsequently suicide, precipitated a rebellion. These are all, what are they, ladies and gentlemen? Illusions. So look them up, study them. So they're giving her examples of these examples for a reason. They're talking about the self-sacrifice of these people. Why? Because they want to start making her feel guilty. These examples were followed by a fantastic story hatched in the imagination of these ignorant plutocrats. This is the third-person narrator calling them ignorant plutocrats. What's a plutocrat? It's a person whose power derives from their wealth. But he calls them ignorant plutocrats. Ignorant is an adjective modifying this. He's calling them ignorant. And we have to believe the third-person narrator, thank goodness, telling how the women of Rome had gone to Capua in order to rock Hannibal to sleep in their arms, and with him his lieutenants, his phalanxes of mercenaries. And then they cited all the women who had halted conquerors by turning their bodies into battlefields, into instruments of domination, into weapons. Women who by means of their heroic caresses had overcome hideous or hated creatures and sacrificed their chastity on the altar of revenge and devotion. So they're making this stuff up. There's no evidence that women of Rome went to rock Hannibal to sleep. There's no evidence of this. They're making this up. They even referred in veiled terms to a certain English lady of good family who had herself inoculated with a horrible contagious disease in order to transmit it to Bonaparte, who had been miraculously saved by a sudden indisposition at the moment of the fateful meeting. I look for a story like this, ladies and gentlemen. I can't find it. I cannot find it. They're making this stuff up. All these stories were told in a decent and decorous manner, with occasional outbursts of deliberate enthusiasm calculated to inspire emulation. What's emulation? Emulation is copying. They want her to copy this, so they would erupt in emotion certain times. By the time they had finished, anybody might have thought that the woman's only duty on earth was the perpetual sacrifice of her person, a continual surrender of her body to the lustful capriciousness of military men. The two nuns, however, gave the impression of hearing nothing of all this. They were so absorbed in profound meditation while Boule de Suif remained silent. All afternoon, she was left to her own reflections. So it's part of the plot, right? But instead of her calling her Madame, right, as they had done so far, they addressed her simply as Mademoiselle. Nobody quite knew why, as if they wanted to take her down a peg from the position of respect to which that she had attained and made her conscious of her shameful situation. So it's like calling Ms., right, Madam, Mademoiselle. Just as the soup was being served, Monsieur Flauvenet reappeared with the same question on the previous day. The Prussian officer wishes to know if Mademoiselle Elizabeth Rosette has changed her mind yet. Boule de Suif replied curtly, No, monsieur. Over dinner, coalition weakened. Loisio made three unfortunate remarks. Everybody was racking his brains for fresh examples, but without success. And when the Countess, possibly with a deliberate intent and simply from a vague desire to pay homage to religion, she questioned the elder of the nuns about the great events in the lives of the saints. Many of them had done things which we would regard as crimes, but the church makes no difficulties about granting absolution for such offenses when they are committed for the glory of God or the benefit of one's neighbor. This was a powerful argument, and the Countess made the most of it. Then, either by one of those tacit understandings, tacit, understood, or implied without being stated, those veiled complexities in which all who wear the ecclesiastical dress excel, they're very good at this, or simply as the result of a fortunate lack of intelligence and opportune stupidity, the old nun gave tremendous support to the conspiracy. So the narrator is telling us they have, nuns have this understanding, right? The veiled complexities who wear ecclesiastical dress, the nuns, or an opportune stupidity. They're just stupid. Suddenly the nun gives, they help support the conspiracy. The older nun. This is the one with the pock face, right? They had thought that this nun was shy, but she now showed herself to be bold, garrulous, talkative, and violent. She wasn't worried by the fumbling arguments of casuistry. Her doctrine seemed to be as firm as an iron bar. Her faith never faltered, and her conscience, they knew no scruple. She regarded Abraham's sacrifice perfectly natural, for she would have killed her father and mother without a qualm on an order from on high. If you don't know, if you're not familiar with this, again, these are allusions, and it's important to understand the allusions, the references to these stories. Abraham was told by God to kill his only son, to sacrifice his son for the love of God. It's a powerful story in the Bible. All the stories in the Bible are powerful. So the nun regarded his sacrifice as perfectly natural. Are you kidding? She would have killed her mother and father without a qualm if God told her to do it. And nothing in her opinion could be displeasing to the Lord if the intention was praiseworthy. And the Countess, taking advantage of the sacred authority of her unexpected ally, egged her on to deliver an edifying paraphrase of the moral axiom, the end justifies the means. Are you familiar with that? The end justifies the means. You know what an axiom is? You should look it up. What's a moral axiom? The end justifies the means. Think about this. That's going to come up in our analysis. So, sister, says the Countess, you think that all means are acceptable to God and that he pardons any act when the motive is pure? Who could doubt it, madame? An action which is blameworthy in itself often becomes meritorious by virtue of the idea which inspires it. And so they went on, interpreting the will of God, predicting his decisions, and attributing to God an interest in things which were really no concern of his. Don't forget who's saying this, who's narrating this, right? The third person narrator. All of this was said in elusive, subtle, discreet language. But every word spoken by the holy woman in the coif, the hood, made a breach in the prostitute's indignant resistance. Then the conversation took a different turn as the woman with the rosary spoke of the houses of her order, of her Mother Superior, of herself, of her sweet companion, dear Sister Saint Nifon. They had been summoned to Le Havre to nurse the hundreds of smallpox cases in the hospitals there. She painted a picture of those poor men, describing their disease in detail, and while they were being held up here by the caprice of this Prussian, scores of Frenchmen might die, whose lives could be perhaps have saved. Nursing soldiers was her specialty. She had been in the Crimea, in Italy, in Austria, and in telling the story of her campaigns, she suddenly revealed herself as one of those drum and fife nuns who seem to have been born to follow armies and pick up wounded in the wake of battle, and who are better than any officer at quelling tough, undisciplined soldiers with a single word. Makes you wonder why they didn't send her into the Prussian. She was, in fact, a typical army sister whose ravaged face, scarred and pitted with countless pockmarks, was like a symbol of the devastation of war. Her words seemed to have made such an impression that after she had finished, nobody added anything. And as soon as the meal was over, they all went straight to their rooms, and they didn't come down again until late next morning. Lunch was a quiet meal. The seed sown the previous evening was being given time to germinate and bear fruit. In the afternoon, the Countess suggested a walk, and the Count gave his arm to Boule de Suif, as had been arranged beforehand, and lingered with her behind the others. I want to say a bad word now. These people are vicious. They're vicious. The Count spoke to Boule de Suif in that familiar, paternal, slightly supercilious tone, which staid elder gentlemen adopt in conversation with women of her profession, calling her, "my dear child," and talking down to her from the height of his exalted social rank and his undisputed respectability. Is his respectability undisputed? Or is the narrator being ironic? He went straight to the heart of the matter. So, my dear, you prefer to keep us here, exposed like yourself to all the outrages which would ensue if the Prussian troops suffered a reverse, rather than grant one of those favors which you have bestowed so often in the course of your life. Boule de Suif made no reply. He tried gentleness on her, and then argument, then appeals to her feelings. He managed to remain Monsieur le Comte all the time, although he could play the ladies' man when necessary, paying compliments and generally making himself agreeable. He emphasized the service that she would be rendering them and spoke of their gratitude. And then suddenly, addressing her with gay familiarity, he exclaimed, "And you know, my dear, he'd be able to boast of having enjoyed a prettier girl than he's likely to find in his own country." Ah! Boule de Suif made no reply and caught up with the others. As soon as they got back to the inn, she went up to her room and didn't reappear. The suspense was acute. What was she going to do? How awkward it would be if she continued to hold out. Dinner time arrived, and they waited for her in vain. And then Monsieur Flauvenet came in and announced that Mademoiselle Rosette was indisposed and that they might start dinner without her. They all pricked up their ears. The Count went to the innkeeper and whispered, Is everything all right?" "Yes." Out of a sense of propriety, he refrained from saying anything to his companions, but he gave them a slight nod. And immediately everyone heaved a great sigh of relief. Every face lit up. "Hooray!" shouted Loisio. "I'm standing champagne all around if there's any to be had in this place." To Madame Loisio's horror, the landlord came back with 4 bottles. Everybody had suddenly become voluble and noisy and full of ribald merriment. The Count seemed to notice Madame's charms for the first time, and the manufacturer complimented the Countess on her beauty. The conversation became lively, gay, racy. All of a sudden, Loisio assumed a worried expression. He raised his arms and he called for silence. Everybody stopped, talking, taken by surprise, almost frightened, and then, cocking his head, motioning to them to keep quiet, he looked up at the ceiling, listened once again, and said in his ordinary voice, "Don't worry, everything's going well." They took some time to grasp his meaning, but then a smile went around the table. You see this word that Jimmy wrote down here? Ass. This guy, Loisio, is an ass. Quarter of an hour later, he went through the same performance again, repeating it several times in the course of an evening. He pretended to be questioning somebody on the floor above and giving them ambiguous advice, fished up from the depths of his commercial traveler's mind. And from time to time, he put on a sorrowful expression and sighed, "Poor girl!" And he muttered angrily between his teeth, "Oh, you Prussian swine!" And sometimes when everybody least expected it, he would repeat several times in a voice vibrant with emotion, "Stop it! Stop it!" adding as if to himself, "I only hope we see her again and the bastard doesn't kill her." Read this word again. Although these jokes were in deplorable taste, the third-person narrator says this. Jimmy doesn't say it. Everybody enjoyed them. Nobody was shocked, for indignation, like everything else, is a product of the environment. See the arrow? Indignation, like everything else, is the product of the environment. Dostoevsky said, right? Man gets used to everything, ... the beast. And the atmosphere which had been gradually been created around them was charged with salacious thoughts. What's salacious? Arousing or appealing to sexual desire and imagination. These are, I don't want to say anything because, norms are different, right? People think that, oh, this is smart. She should have done it anyway, right? Some people are saying that who are reading with Jimmy. That's not the point. You got to get into the story and put yourself in her shoes, Boule de Suif's shoes, put yourself in these guys' shoes. Put yourself in the Prussian officer's shoes and ask yourself, what is the third person narrator trying to show us here? We're going to talk about that in our analysis. Over dessert, even the women made discreetly witty allusions. Eyes were sparkling, for everybody had drunk a good deal. The Count, who had even in his cups preserved his air of noble gravity, drew a comparison, which was greatly appreciated, between their situation and that of a shipwrecked sailors at the pole, rejoicing when winter comes to an end and a way to the south opens up before them. Loisio, who was by now in very high spirits, stood up with a glass of champagne in his hand, and he cried, "I drink to our deliverance." Everybody rose and applauded. Even the two nuns, egged on by the ladies, agreed to take a sip of the sparkling wine, which they had never tasted before. They said it was like fizzy lemonade, but with a more delicate flavor. Loisio gave expression to the general feeling when he said, what a pity we haven't got a piano. We might have a bit of dancing." Courtenay hadn't uttered a single word or made a single gesture. Oh, happy face, right? Indeed, he seemed too deep in serious thought, and he tugged angrily at his great beard now and then, as if he wanted to make it even longer than it was. And at last, toward midnight, when the party was on the point of breaking up, Loisio walked unsteadily over to him, dug him in the ribs, and said in a thick voice, "You're not much fun tonight, are you? Cat got your tongue, citizen?" Courtenay raised his head sharply, glaring at the company with flashing eyes, and said, "I tell you, you've all done a shameful thing tonight." He stood up and made his way to the door. "A shameful thing," he repeated, and he disappeared. This dampened their spirits for a moment. Loisio, utterly taken aback, stood there gaping, but he soon recovered his composure and suddenly burst out laughing. "Sour grapes!" he exclaimed. "Sour grapes!" Nobody understood what he meant. He told them about the secrets of the corridor, and there was a fresh outburst of merriment. The ladies were tremendously amused, while the Count and Monsieur Lamandin laughed until they cried. They couldn't believe their ears. "Are you sure? Really? He wanted? I tell you, I saw him," Loisio said. "And she refused because the Prussian was in the next room." "I don't believe it. I swear it's true." The Count was choking with laughter, and the manufacturer holding his sides. Louisio went on, and now you understand why he didn't see the joke tonight. Why Courtenay didn't see the joke tonight. What joke? What joke, ladies and gentlemen? What joke? What joke? The three of them started off again, laughing until they were gasping for breath. And then the party broke up. But Madame Louisio, who had a temperament like a stinging nettle, remarked to her husband as they were getting into bed, that little sourpuss, Madame Carré-Lamandon, had been looking peeved all evening. You know, when a woman's mad about a uniform, it doesn't matter to her whether it's a Frenchman or a Prussian. It makes you sick. It really does. Eh. All night long, the dark corridor was full of rustling sounds, faint, barely audible noises, like the patter of bare feet, the imperceptible creaking of boards, and from the thin lines of light showing under the doors, it was clear that nobody went to sleep until very late. Champagne has that effect. It's said to keep people awake. The next morning, the snow was dazzling white in the bright winter sun. The coach, ready at long last, was standing in the door, while the army of white pigeons with pink eyes and black pupils were preening themselves in their thick plumage and strutting between the legs of the 6 horses, pecking for food in the steaming dung. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about this. I want you to see that arrow? It's a big arrow. The coach, ready at long last, was standing at the door with an army of white pigeons with pink eyes and black pupils, cleaning themselves in their thick plumage and strutting about between the legs of those 6 horses, pecking for food in the steaming dung. What's going on? The pigeons are cleaning themselves in the horse shit. I don't think that's an accident that the third person narrator said this. I don't think so. I think this is the perfect metaphor for what these people did. But we can talk about that. The driver, wrapped in a sheepskin coat, was puffing at his pipe at the box, and the delighted travelers were all hurried, packing their provisions for the rest of the journey. Only Boule de Suif was missing, and at last she appeared. She seemed a little ill at ease and shamefaced. And as she walked shyly toward her companions, they turned away with one accord as if they had not seen her. The Count took his wife's arm with a dignified air and drew her out of range of that impure contact. The fat young woman stopped short in amazement, and then, summoning all her courage, she greeted the manufacturer's wife with a humble, "Good morning, madame." The other woman merely returned a supercilious nod, accompanied by a glare of outraged virtue. Everybody seemed very busy, and they gave her a wide berth, as if she were carrying some infection in her skirts. And then they made a dash for the coach. Boule de Suif was the last to reach it, and silently took her seat she occupied during the first part of the journey. So don't forget the way they lined up in the coach. They didn't seem to see her or recognize her, but Madame Louisio, gazing at her indignantly from a distance, said in a low voice to her husband, "I'm glad I'm not sitting next to her." Jesus Christ. The heavy coach moved off, and the second part of the journey started. At first, no one said a word. Boule de Suif didn't dare to raise her eyes. She felt angry with all her neighbors, ashamed of having given way to their pleas, and defiled by the kisses of the Prussian into whose arms that they had hypocritically thrown her. And after a while, the Countess turned to Madame Carré-Lamandon and broke the awkward silence. "I believe you know Madame d'Estrades?" "Yes, she's a friend of mine." What a charming woman she is. Delightful. Quite exceptional person and well educated too. And an artist at her fingertips. She sings divinely. And she draws beautifully. The manufacturer started talking to the Count, and above the rattle of the windows, a few words were audible. Dividend. Fall due. Option. Mature. Louisio, who had filched the inn's old pack of cards, he stole the inn's old pack of cards, greasy from 5 years' contact with filthy tables, embarked on a game of bisque with his wife. The nuns, taking long rosaries hanging from their belts, crossed themselves simultaneously, and all of a sudden their lips started moving, the speed of their murmured prayers increasing as if they were engaged in a race. From time to time they would kiss a medal, cross themselves again, and then resume their rapid, endless mumbling. Cornadet sat motionless, deep in thought. After 3 hours traveling, Louisio gathered up his cards and said, I'm hungry. His wife reached for a packet done up with string from which she took a piece of cold veal. She cut this into neat, thin slices, and they both started eating. Why don't we follow suit? Said the Countess. There was a chorus of approval, and she set about unpacking the food which they had prepared for the two couples. In one of those long receptacles with the china hair on the lid to indicate the contents, there was a liver pâté, a succulent cold dish in which the hare's dark flesh mixed with other finely chopped meats was streaked with white rivulets of bacon fat. There was also a fine slab of Gruyère, which bore the words news and brief from the sticky surface, for it had been wrapped in a piece of newspaper, so it stuck to the outside of the cheese. The two nuns unwrapped a hunk of sausage with smelt of garlic, and Cordanet, plunging both hands at the same time into the capacious pockets of his loose-fitting overcoat, took out 4 hard-boiled eggs out of one and a crusty end of a loaf of bread from the other. Shelling the first egg and dropping the pieces of shell in the raw straw on the floor, he bit into it, scattering his great beard with fragments of yellow yolk, which shone in it like stars. Boule de Suif, in a hurry and confusion of getting up, hadn't time to think of anything, and now she watched all her neighbors placidly eating. She found herself choking with rage and indignation. In the first flush of anger, she opened her mouth to tell them what she thought of them. And a flood of abuse rose to her lips, but her exasperation was so violent she couldn't utter a word. Nobody looked at her. Nobody gave her a thought. She felt overwhelmed by the contempt of these respectable boors who had first sacrificed her and then cast her aside like an unclean object for which they had no further use. And then she remembered her big basket full of good things which they had guzzled. Her 2 chickens in aspic, her pâtés, her pears, her 4 bottles of claret. Her anger suddenly collapsed like a cord snapping when it had been stretched too tight. She felt on the verge of tears. She made a tremendous effort to control her feelings, bracing herself, swallowing her sobs like a little child. But her tears welled up, glistened on her eyelids, and soon 2 great drops brimmed over and rolled down her cheeks. Others followed more rapidly, flowing like drops of water, trickling from a rock and falling at regular intervals onto her bosom's swelling curve. She sat erect, staring straight in front of her, her face pale, set, hoping that nobody would notice. But the Countess saw her distress, and she drew her husband's attention to it with a gesture, and he shrugged his shoulders to say, "Oh, what of it? It isn't my fault." Madame Louisio gave a silent laugh and whispered triumphantly, She's crying because she's ashamed of herself." The two nuns had returned to their prayers after wrapping up what was left of the sausage in a piece of paper. And then Courtenay, who was digesting his eggs, stretched his long legs under the opposite seat, leaned back, folded his arms, smiled like a man who had just thought of a good joke, and started whistling the Marseillaise. That's the song of the Republic. A shadow fell across every face, because the song of the Republic was obviously not to his neighbor's liking. They fidgeted irritably, and they looked as if they'd been ready to howl like dogs hearing the sound of a barrel organ. And he noticed this, and he went on whistling. And now and then he even hummed the words. Scan love of the homeland, lead, support our avenging arms. Freedom, freedom, darling, fights with defenders. They were all moving faster now, for the snow was harder. And all the way to Dieppe, through the long, tedious hours of the long journey along the bumpy roads, in the gathering dusk, and later in the darkness which filled the coach, he kept his monotonous, vengeful whistling with savage obstinacy, forcing his tired, exasperated listeners to follow the song from beginning to end, and to fit the appropriate word to every note. Boule de Suif went on crying. Now and then, in the pause between two verses, a sob, which he had been unable to hold back, could be heard in the darkness. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy. I'm stunned by this story. Every time I read this story, I'm stunned. I'm stunned. We're going to talk about this in the analysis of Boule de Suif. Be sure to read that and look for other classics that we can read together. If you have questions, Reading with Jimmy, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com is my email. Please email me. And please remember, I'm going to leave you with this thought. We read to see how other people lead their lives and how to lead ours. I hope you don't look at any of these people, except for Boule de Suif, as models to base your life on. This is just a tremendous, tremendous short story. We're going to talk about it when we analyze it. Thanks for listening. Stay safe.